who've joined us so far. 107, 402 have signed up. So we'll probably get some more emerging and plenty watching online afterwards, who are clearly very interested in this focus about promoting reading across transition. I just want to introduce Jessie Ricketts and LARA Shapiro to you. Jessie is a professor of language, memory and attention in the Department of Psychology at Royal Holloway. And LARA is a doctor, indeed a reader, in the School of Psychology at Aston University. Recent papers, I'm just going to mention a few so that you get a sense of a wider ken of their work rather than just this particular focus. Some of Jessie's recent papers have involved reading enjoyment with adults with dyslexia and the power of learning lexical representations. Some of LARA's recent papers, I had a fascinating time actually reading through all this. I was thinking, well, that's interesting. Let's click on this link. No, Teresa, concentrate on the job. Were focused on, some of LARA's papers have been focused on do family learning of phonics improve parental reading and their ability to support their young people, and the comparison of additional training in phoneme awareness, letter sound knowledge and decoding for struggling and beginning readers. But the reason that we invited them together here today was in part because of their joint work around the Love to Read programme, and indeed their joint work around the fiction and theories of mind in adolescence, but most significantly really because they'd completed a study which I'm sure we'll hear more about around reading and transition, funded by the Nuffield Foundation. It focused in particular on reading and vocabulary and explored how skilled independent readers, how the notion of being a skilled independent reader and the skills you have supports vocabulary learning in primary and through into secondary. So I'm delighted they're able to join us. Their title is What Do We Know and What Can We Do? And I'm going to hand over now to Jessie. Jessie, do take the screen. I'll stop sharing and over to you. We are recording this, as you've probably seen. We will be placing the video on the Literacy and Social Justice Centre website, so you can follow up and watch again there should you wish. But do, as we travel, write any questions you have or queries in the chat line. And when they've spoken for around 40-45 minutes, there will be time for questions and responses at the end. So thank you. Over to you, Jessie.
Sorry, I just need to unmute myself before I share, because it's difficult to do that once I'm sharing. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Hopefully you can see that. I can't see anyone now, so just let me know if that's not working. But I will assume otherwise.
It's super, thanks.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and actually amazing to see so many different people joining today. There's definitely some names that I recognize in the mix, but great to see people coming from a range of charities, from libraries, from lots of different kinds of schools and different settings, and also researchers as well. Great to see someone coming from New Zealand. I spent my childhood in New Zealand, so that's really nice too, to see people from so far away. So, as Teresa said, LARA and I are both engaged in a wide range of research projects around reading and around language, but we're both particularly passionate about this work, looking at reading across transition. And what we're going to do today between us is talk a little bit about what we know at the moment and what we found out from our research, and also what we think we can do about it, or what we think it means. So I'm going to start off, and I'm going to talk, I'll just keep an eye on the time, for about 20 minutes or so, and then I will hand over to LARA. Now, when I talk to any audience about work on reading and reading research, I always think it's really important to just take a little step back at the beginning to think about what we're talking about and what our definitions are. And I think that's really important for reading, because we are all readers, and we all spend a lot of time thinking about reading. And so it is really important, I think, to hone in on the kind of definitions that we're talking about today. So I'm sure you pause in your practice or in your research or in your daily lives to think about what reading is, what it is to you, what it is for your students if you're teaching, what it means to your students for them, what it might mean for different people in different contexts. And of course, we can think about what it might be to be successful in reading. And actually, that's what we're going to focus on quite a lot today. But also, we might think about what it is to be a reader and to have that identity. So, of course, we can take a very broad definition of reading. That's my point here. But actually, for today, we're going to primarily focus on a slightly narrower definition, which doesn't cover everything about reading that's important. I think that's really important to say. But what it does is it hones in on and focuses in on what is necessary for reading success. And I think when you're thinking about reading for young people in schools, thinking about reading success is of course really important. And what we can do here is we can use the simple view of reading as a framework. And in doing that, we are talking about two things that are important for reading success. So we're talking about word reading and we're talking about language comprehension. And we're going to come back to both of those things and unpick them a little bit and unpick how they relate to reading engagement a bit later on in the session today. But I'm just going to start off by giving you a sense of the plan. So I'm going to talk initially about the Reading and Vocabulary Project, which is a project that Laura and I completed together, funded by the Nuffield Foundation, as Teresa said, where we looked at reading and vocabulary across transition from primary to secondary. So that's the main focus of what we're going to say today. Then I'm going to move on to talk just briefly about what reading proficiency is. So I will start with the simple view of reading and just kind of unpick a little bit what reading proficiency is. And that's not to say that we in this meeting don't all know what reading proficiency is. It's more that we might have slightly different interpretations about what we're talking about. And so it's just to make sure that we're all on the same page and we've all got a shared understanding of what we're talking about today. Laura is then going to talk about how we can promote reading proficiency and what reading engagement is and how we can promote that too. So that's a kind of the shape of what's going to happen today. So I will start off by talking about the Reading and Vocabulary Project. What I'm going to end up doing is telling you about 5 messages that come from that project. Now, the Reading and Vocabulary Project was a longitudinal project where we tracked young people as they moved from upper primary into lower secondary school. And we set out to look at a range of things. Some of those things were theoretically driven, some of those things were practically driven by what we thought was important to know for practice. And we ended up with some findings. And actually, as a researcher, and those of you who are doing research in the room will know, we have our findings that we get, but there's often a bit of a gap between what those findings actually are and the messages that we think they convey. So the things that they actually tell us for theory, for research, but also for practice. And so what Laura and I have spent a lot of time doing over the last year or two since we've finished that project is we have spent a lot of time thinking about what the key messages are, we think, for educational practice that come out of that Reading and Vocabulary Project. And these are the 5 key messages. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we arrived at those messages and what the underpinning research is for each of them in a moment. But the first is that teacher training must be prioritised, that we don't need to worry about a transition slump for reading or for vocabulary, that reading is not just a primary school issue. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here on that one. That a 2-step approach to screening and assessment can help us, can move us forward in our quest to ensure that young people can read and can access text, and that both reading proficiency and reading engagement matter. And again, I'm sure I'm absolutely speaking to the converted on that front here too. If you want to have a look at our public report, you can see that following this link here. But I'm going to take those messages one at a time now. Just to remind you or give you a sense of this longitudinal project. So we followed children up, and actually this was a continuation of the Aston Literacy Project that Laura started quite some time ago on school entry. So these are young people that we've followed up right from school entry, and they've now left compulsory full-time education. But the bit that I'm focusing on today is this area around year 6, year 7, year 8 as they transition from primary to secondary. And what's important about this study is that we were following the same children up over time, but that we also looked at what was happening within the school year, so change and development that was happening within the school year, as well as change and development that was happening across these 2 summer holidays. So the summer holiday in which they transition from primary to secondary school, and also another summer holiday where they transition from year 7 to year 8. So they're not changing context, not changing school. And so we've got about 300 young people in this project. The larger longitudinal project is a bit larger than that, but what we're focusing on today is these 300. And we measured a range of things, including word reading, reading comprehension, various different kinds of vocabulary, and socioeconomic status, as well as reading engagement, reading amount, and so on. So the first point then, okay, well, we need to prioritize teacher training. That may seem like a kind of obvious thing to say in this context, but I think it's quite interesting to know where it comes from. And where it comes from in our data is the observation that reading abilities across this phase are so incredibly variable. And that's what you can see on this graph. So the individual dots in this graph correspond to individual students or children. And you can see the same children being followed up over time. So we saw them in year 5, year 6, beginning of year 7, end of year 7, and then in year 8. And I think what you can see really clearly in this graph is just how variable reading abilities are. And the same is true for vocabulary too, incidentally. So incredibly variable. Now, we did expect a lot of variation, but this was more than we had anticipated. And this replicates work that I'd done in lower secondary previously, this sheer variability. We do see some progress over time. That is important. It's probably it's certainly meaningful for those young people. They're getting better at reading, but the variability amongst young people it kind of dwarfs that progress, if you like. And I think you can see that really clearly here. The other thing just to note while you're looking at this is that if you look at the variation in reading ability, so that kind of distribution, it's very, very overlapping in year 5 and in year 8, if you look at the extremes of this graph. And so what that tells us is that it doesn't matter if we're standing in front of a group of year 5s or a group of year 8s. The variability in knowledge and skills that they have in the room is very similar. It's not the same. The year 8s are on average a little bit better than the year 5s, but the variation is very overlapping. And I think that's really important because, of course, the challenge that they face is a bit different from the curriculum and otherwise. But the bottom line here is if reading ability is that variable, that presents a huge challenge for any teacher who is kind of supporting the learning of those students, because that's a very difficult thing to negotiate. And actually, that's true for me and Laura as well when we kind of stand in front of our undergraduate students too. So reading is really variable, and therefore we must prioritize teacher training because it's something that everybody needs to know about, that it's variable and that it's important. One of the things we set out to kind of interrogate with this study was whether there's a transition slump in reading. There was quite a strong narrative, I think, that there is a transition slump. So that is that reading ability either stagnates or indeed maybe goes down on transition from primary to secondary school. And we were interested to look at this in a systematic way. And what we did is we used the same assessments over time. So we were comparing like by like. So we had a robust kind of test of whether there was this slump, but also that we compared a transition and a non-transition summer holiday. So we're looking at whether anything unusual or different or any stagnation or going down is happening on the transition summer holiday, and whether that summer holiday is special compared to another summer holiday. And actually what we found was there was no evidence of a transition slump. So we saw reading abilities continuing to progress in both summer holidays. So no evidence for a transition slump. So that's not something that we need to be worried about. I mean, one of the things I know we've been very keen to convey, and this is, something that we're conveying to people in the Department for Education and government policymakers, and also to a range of other partners in this work, is that we can't think of reading as just a primary issue. And for those of you who are finding it tricky to convey that message to whoever you're working with, I think there's two ways that this can be conveyed really clearly. So the first is just to say that even if we have, as we do, I think, very robust approaches for supporting early reading in primary school and identifying reading needs where they occur, even if we have very robust processes for doing that, some reading needs we know are going to be quite persistent over time. And so it can never just be a primary issue, because we need to pick those children up as they move into secondary school, and we need to continue to support them throughout the school system. So that's the first thing that's worth saying. I think the second way to kind of argue this case is to say that some young people don't have reading needs at the beginning of their journey of learning to read, and their needs only emerge as the challenge of reading changes over time. So as reading perhaps becomes more about reading comprehension, or becomes more about reading more complex texts or types of texts, that is when the challenge kind of emerges for them, and that's when their reading needs therefore emerge. So if we only identified reading needs early, those children would fall through the net. We just wouldn't catch those children at all. So we need to have this kind of consistent and continued and prolonged approach to supporting reading needs. So some of the work I've been doing, particularly with schools around the country, actually, but this work emerged from a collaboration with all secondary schools in Blackpool, is looking at this kind of two-step approach to identifying reading needs and aligning reading needs very, very carefully with the kind of support that young people are getting. And that could be support in the mainstream classroom, or it could be more targeted support as well. And finally, and I think this is a really exciting thing to be talking about, particularly in this context, it's emphasizing the importance that reading proficiency and reading engagement go together. They both matter, and we need to think about both of those things in an integrated way together. Now, what we found about this was that just because young people will have the proficiency doesn't mean that they necessarily are avid readers. So there are plenty of young people who are good, skilled readers who don't read regularly. And I'm sure that resonates with your experience. It is certainly the case that there is a kind of symbiotic relationship between reading proficiency and reading engagement. So if you're better at reading, you're more likely to read more and to engage with it and gain more pleasure from it. If all of those latter things are true, then you build your reading proficiency with practice. So that's absolutely true. But of course, the reading proficiency needs to come first. So we need to open up the world of reading for that young person first, and then they can get into that wonderful virtuous circle. So those are the 5 messages: that we must prioritize teacher training, that we don't need to worry about a transition slump, that reading is a primary and a secondary school issue, that if we want to make sure we are identifying reading needs and supporting children, a 2-step approach using assessment can really help and complement what we're already doing, and that both reading and proficiency go together and really matter. So on that note, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to the next, to my next bit of the presentation, and then Laura is going to talk more about reading proficiency and reading engagement. Okay, so coming back to what I said at the beginning then. So I talked about the simple view of reading and how that tells us the 2 things that are necessary for reading success. So it doesn't tell us everything we might want or need to know about reading, absolutely not. But it reminds us of what's absolutely crucial for reading success. That is the ability to read words and the ability to understand language. I also find the simple view of reading really helpful because it helps us to think about variation in reading ability. And it reminds us that reading varies on at least 2 dimensions. So reading is not just a kind of unidimensional thing where you're either very good at it, you do it lots, or you're not. Actually, it's much more complex than that. And what you can see here is children varying across a kind of 2-dimensional space in relation to both word reading and language comprehension. So you've got children in the top right-hand corner here. I'm not sure if you can see the cursor, but top right-hand corner here, who are successful readers. And then you've got 3 groups of students who might have reading needs. Those who have challenges with word reading or language comprehension, or down in the bottom left here with both. And so it helps us to think about, for our group of children that we might be working with, what is the kind of variability going to look like? And it reminds us that it's going to vary on at least 2 dimensions. We could also think about it varying in terms of reading engagement as well. That could be a 3rd dimension. Not quite as easy to visualize in 2D that way, though. So that's a simple view of reading. I think it's really useful. Doesn't tell us everything we need to know, but it is a really useful starting point. And of course, you can present the simple view of reading in many ways, and this is another way of presenting it. And I find this really useful, this reading comprehension house, because instead of kind of emphasizing individual differences as we see here, it kind of pinpoints the pressure points to successful reading in a little bit more detail and unpacks what sits underneath word reading and language comprehension. So you can see the simple view of reading here. You can see word reading, you can see language comprehension as holding up this roof that is reading comprehension. But then underneath that, for example, for word reading, you've got distinction between decoding, being able to, so kind of effortfully reading words letter by letter, being able to recognize words, being able to do all of that fluently. And under language comprehension, you've got being able to make inferences, monitoring comprehension, text structure, and so on. So it unpacks things a little bit. And I'm just going to very briefly, because I don't want to take up too much time, but just kind of unpack things a little bit on both of those fronts. So when I'm just going to pull up all of the animation there. So when we think about learning to read words in English, what we need our young people to be able to do is to have a flexible word recognition system that allows them to read a range of words. So they need to be able to read words that are spelt the way that they sound. So words like bed and chicken that you can sound out readily. Our young people also need to be able to read the kind of unusual words or words with unexpected spellings or irregular words that we see in English, like brooch and yacht, words for which if you use the usual rules to read those words, you'd come up with a mispronunciation like brooch and yacht. Crucially, though, we also need our young people to be able to read words that they haven't seen before. And we need to have a strategy that allows us to do that because, of course, we do encounter new words in print all of the time. And this is just a reminder that, of course, a non-word or a made-up word is only a made-up word until you've seen it. And whenever I choose made-up words for this presentation, someone always comes to me and says, oh, I've seen that word. That is a real word. So just to say that if you've bought any water in China, you might know the word Gantin already. But being able to kind of approach the range of words in the English language, which is why phonics is so very important, because by teaching our young people phonics, we are upskilling them. We are giving them the code that exists so that then they can teach themselves to read and they can expand their own word knowledge so that they can then recognize words effectively and efficiently over time. And then finally, just a quick note before I move on to Laura, on reading comprehension. So reading comprehension, needless to say, is very complex and it's underpinned by a very complex set of knowledge and skills, some of which are captured in this reading comprehension house. And it's all about this very active, constructive process of building a mental model. And sometimes when we are working with young people, and this is true of my undergraduate students as well, it's important to kind of remind them that reading is something that they need to actively engage in. It's going to go much better if you're consciously, actively thinking about what you're reading, both in terms of enjoyment and also in terms of success. And so this is just to remind us that that's actually a very complex process to get to that point of having a mental model of the text. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to Laura. I think what I might do is actually just stop sharing for a moment because I can't see anything. And then when she comes on, I will...
in which case I can try sharing mine.
Can you? Have you got it up?
Yeah, I'll try that.
Okay.
Thank you, both of you. That's fascinating, Jessie. I'm sure we moved on.
Actually, keep yours shared, but Jessie, please, because mine doesn't seem to be sharing.
No, that's fine. So I'll share it now. Laura, you'll just have to tell me when you want to move on because I can't see anything.
Will do. All right, thanks so much. Okay, thanks, Jessie. So just just wait for the slides to reappear. Hopefully you can all see, we want to be slide 21. Great. So I'm going to talk about some work that we've done on how to support reading proficiency. If you can just make it full screen. Great, thank you. So for most children, they'll do really well in a mainstream teaching through phonics teaching, which is taught in a very fun way alongside a well-stocked library. And for many children, this will be very effective in terms of promoting their reading proficiency. And just to build on what Jessie said, so Jessie talked about the logic of phonics teaching, which is very, very well established. There is also really strong evidence that it is effective. And I've just cited here a nice study by economists who've looked at the fact that it was introduced on a gradual basis, LEA to LEA, which means that you can then look at that influence of this change to phonics teaching on quite a large scale. And they found that it was particularly effective for children who were struggling with reading, so children in the at-risk group. However, from talking to teachers, it seems that there is an issue about how you support children who seem to be having difficulties despite lots of phonics, lots of high quality phonics teaching. And in order to support them, teachers are faced with quite a bewildering choice of commercial interventions. So there's a really, really fantastic service, the What Works database, which is really, really nice for showing all of the different interventions out there. But it's a huge choice, and they vary enormously in price, and it's actually very difficult to navigate. So if you move on to the next slide, thanks. So what I've done with a team of researchers is to look at whether we can find some clearer principles for helping teachers decide where the support should be targeted for children who are struggling. And we focused on this beginning stage of reading, so first year of phonics instruction, first year of formal schooling, and looking at how can you support those children that are most at risk of struggling to keep up with the rest of the class in terms of following the phonics mainstream phonics instruction. And we compared in a very experimental way, in a very sort of controlled way, what happens when you give children extra training on different aspects of reading, of the reading process. So we looked at what happens if you give them training just on segmenting and blending the sounds of words. What happens if you give them training just on the letter sounds? And what happens if you give them extra training on segmenting and blending the letters of written words? And this probably sounds really artificial to teachers, because obviously it's not intended as an intervention that you just go out there and you do this really, really fine-grained work. But what it can tell you is what are the relative benefits of each type of training in a very, very controlled way, using a perfectly matched set of words and matched sets of pictures. So you move to the next slide. Thanks. What we found was actually any type of training was equally beneficial for reading outcomes. And we were, even though these were the lowest 50% of readers in reception, and they weren't able to read any of the words at the beginning of the study, they were actually achieving quite well in reading fairly complicated words that they wouldn't normally be able to read. So this extra training was effective. They got 10 sessions of one-to-one training on a set of words, and we looked at how they performed on those particular words and on a generalization set as well. And they're all equally beneficial for reading outcomes. But on the next slide, I've highlighted that actually one of these conditions was significantly better in improving their phoneme awareness outcomes. And so what we're able to say from this study is that if if you focus on their segmenting and their blending of letters in the presence of print, then that has knock-on effects on their phoneme awareness, which will then have knock-on effects on their reading in the long term. So on the next slide, just emphasizing that although it's an experimental study, it's quite precise, but what it can do is indicate sort of the active ingredients for intervention. So most likely, if you focus on blending printed words, that's likely to have the greatest benefit for children struggling with reading in reception. And so it provides one way in to try and navigate this huge database of potential commercial packages. It tries to, is one piece of research that will indicate what the active ingredients might be. So that's in early primary school. Obviously for late primary and secondary, it does get much more complicated, as Jessie was explaining. So you may have children that are absolutely fine in that early reception age, but their difficulties emerge later. And that's why the two-stage process that Jessie explained is so important, because you can have a generic screening which indicates that there are some difficulties there, but you need to follow that up with something much more precise to find out exactly where their difficulties are, because it's not going to be obvious just from hearing a child read. You wouldn't necessarily recognize where the difficulties lie. It needs to be quite diagnostic in terms of the assessments that you do. And then the next step is then obviously to look at what interventions there are in place to support them. And that's something that, again, is very challenging, because there aren't tailored secondary age interventions necessarily out there. And most of the interventions tend to be adapted from primary. So what we've been trying to do in our research is try and make the research transparent to teachers, so we can get some clear messages out there that help teachers to actually identify what the needs are. And then if you give that training to teachers, then they can then make the decisions about which interventions best support what needs to be supported. So there isn't something out there on a plate that can just be taken off the shelf and will necessarily work for every child. It's more a case of trying to understand where are the difficulties. Now I understand the difficulties. Now I can look at the options for interventions and actually select them with that extra knowledge. So next slide, please, Jessie. Okay, so I think the main message here is that it is essential to provide the early support. So children in reception who are struggling with phonics, they do need the extra support. You need to get them off the ground, make sure they keep up with the rest of the class. But it's not going to be sufficient, because some children will still need support later in primary and into secondary school. And even if we manage to get them all reading beautifully when they enter secondary school, even with proficient readers, you can't guarantee that they'll actually engage. Reading engagement doesn't just come for free. It helps. We know that in general, the better readers will read more. And as you get better at reading, you will be encouraged to read more. But engagement is still a big challenge. So on to the next slide. So what is reading engagement? So I've taken the definition from Sarah McGowan's work, which I think is really, so she's done some really fantastic analysis of what we actually mean by reading engagement. So I've taken the definition from her and sort of adapted it. So in what we're talking about here with reading engagement is a child that reads for its own intrinsic value. So we often talk about volitional reading or reading in your own time. But really what we're getting at is the fact that somebody is actually reading for the sake of it. They're not reading something just because they'll get a better mark in the exam, or they've been told to read it by the teacher and they've got to tick off something in a worksheet. They're reading for choice, for its intrinsic value, and they're putting in the cognitive effort needed to actually understand the content. So you're not just surface reading, you're actually putting that effort in. And also you're reading with an emotional connection. So that doesn't mean you're necessarily in floods of tears over something really, really emotional. But it's this kind of immersion that you get from being fully engaged with a piece of text. And you can get that even from a newspaper article or whatever you're reading. It's something that your whole self is part of it. You've got an emotional connection. And then the final part that Sarah McGowan talks about is the social interactions. And that's, it's obviously a really good indicator that somebody is engaged when they're reading if they're sharing it with others. It's obviously not an essential part of reading engagement, but it's a really strong indicator that if you're interested in what you're reading, then you're going to share it with others. And I think capitalizing on that social connection is really important. So on the next slide. So how do we promote this? So next slide. Yeah, so in primary, there's Sarah McGowan's work that Nuffield Foundation grant that Jessie and I were co-investigators on. This is a really promising approach for primary level readers. And so the approach is based on the evidence on how to motivate readers at late primary school, and it focuses very much on ensuring that they have access to books that they're going to enjoy, ensuring that they are skilled in making choices about what they want to read. So just simply throwing a lot of books at somebody is not necessarily giving them the choice, because they need to have the skills in order to make informed decisions about what they're going to enjoy reading. Making the social connections, making time for reading, and ensuring that children are feeling successful in their reading experiences. And that's obviously involving very careful, getting them to make the right choices in terms of what they're reading, and getting the level right and getting the sense of achievement in what they're doing. So that's a really lovely approach at primary level, and it's freely accessible. The website link will be there as well. But at secondary level, there is not currently anything out there in terms of a sort of a reading motivation intervention. The best practice we have at the moment is just independent reading in school time. So the best available option is something along the lines of drop everything and read. So that's obviously commonly used in school, but some kind of some kind of set time to allow children to do independent reading. And there's been a recent meta-analysis looking at the evidence on these kind of approaches in schools, and there is evidence that this improves reading attitudes. So simply putting aside some time to read in schools, giving children the time to do this, is actually beneficial for their reading attitudes. And so that is promising. But what we don't know is whether it has any effect on what they do by choice. So you can sit them down, get them to read in the classroom, but what happens when they go home? Does that actually motivate them to read outside school? There's good evidence that it helps with reading, word reading proficiency as well. So the meta-analysis showed that there was a positive effect on word reading proficiency, but actually no effect on comprehension. So the evidence on the impact of independent reading in school is fairly limited at the moment. And in particular, we don't know how to get children to read for their own enjoyment outside school. In our study, Jessie and I, we tried to, I can see people in the chat making some really nice suggestions of things that are actually happening in secondary schools, which would be brilliant to hear about. So what I'm talking about here, when I'm saying we don't have the evidence for something, what I mean is that it's not out there in the literature yet. There may well be brilliant things happening, but we need to get them out there and actually get evidence about what's actually working. So in our study, we, as part of the Reading and Vocabulary Project, if you can move us to the next slide, Jessie, we we conducted an experiment where we tried to design a way to motivate children to read in their own time. And this was done with early secondary school children, age years 7 to 9. And we looked at whether we can increase the amount that they read through a behavioural change approach. And we use this because it's been really successfully used in health behaviour research. And it is an effective approach where you get people to set their own goals, you get them to keep a diary, they then evaluate their own progress towards those goals. We worked in collaboration with the Oxford University Press, so we could actually see what they were reading in real time. And we had all of the electronic versions of all of the books, so we could actually literally count like their exposure to different words. So if you go to the next slide, Jessie, I'm just going to jump straight to our conclusions. Oh no, I'll just tell you a bit about the diary, sorry. So we worked really, really hard together with teenagers to try and make this acceptable and fun and something that they're likely to engage with. So this behaviour change approach is very much dependent on them setting their goals and them keeping track of in the diary and reporting on their goals and getting feedback on the extent to which they were achieving those goals. And so what we really focused on is trying to get them to do this diary and make it as interesting as possible. And we worked with teenagers and a company called Gorilla who developed the software to do this. So we had a number of workshops with teenagers to get this to work, and it was very attractive. It's really nice. But go to the next slide. It was really useful in an experimental way as a way of showing how when the teenagers were reading books in their own time, the quantity of their reading was linked directly to their vocabulary growth. So we could literally count the number of times they'd seen a particular word, like the word tempest came up in a couple of the books that they were reading, and you could track the number of exposures to that word and the effect that had on their vocabulary. And so that was really exciting from an experimental point of view. But in terms of trying to get them to read, it was really challenging because there was some evidence that it was working. So the children that were engaging with the diary were reading more, but very few of them actually completed the diary consistently. So it was clearly a big challenge. So that's not something that we would recommend is now rolled out to schools because it's because they just didn't engage with it sufficiently. Next slide, Jessie. So this is a big gap. I think what we need to do is think about what our goals are. So if we just simply want children to read more, then drop everything and read type interventions are great. I mean, so they are reading through that, and in terms of increasing social capital, obviously you can tailor what they're reading and make sure that they're getting exposure. But in terms of actually getting young people to want to read, that's where we're really struggling. And Jessie and I have a funding application in progress where we're going to go step back quite a long way and actually talk to young people about what it is that they want from reading and really try and work from the very beginning with young people to figure out how you can share positive experiences of reading among young people. So working much more deeply together with them from the beginning rather than just having a nice idea and then getting them to help tweak it. I think we need to start much, much earlier in the process. Okay, next slide, Jessie. Great, so now I'll hand back to Jessie for the next part.
Thank you so much, Laura. Actually, I've just been having a look through the chat while you've been talking, and it's so amazing to see all of the things that people are commenting on and all of the wonderful things that are going on. And it's always great to hear about that. In fact, I think that's the reason why Laura and I so value giving these kinds of presentations, because actually the thinking and what's happening changes quite a lot over time. So when I started talking about reading cross transition about 15 years ago, the picture looked very, very different. So it's so great to hear what's happening. And in fact, that was really the focus of this last slide, was to just say, it is really important in these situations to share the good practice that is going on. So what are we doing in our schools to identify reading needs? What are we doing to support reading? What are we doing to engage our readers? I love that idea of the kind of pathway, motivation or reading for pleasure being the pathway that leads up to the reading comprehension house. I love that idea. So yeah, it's just a note really to remind us to be sharing good practice. And we're already doing so much of that in the chat. I think we should stop there just so that we've got plenty of time to answer any questions and to have a bit more of a discussion that's driven by those who are here. So I will stop now just to acknowledge all the wonderful people who are involved in all the research that we talked about today very quickly. And then I'm going to stop sharing just so that I think what the team were keen to do is to show our faces a bit more clearly. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. But thank you so much, all of you, for your attention, and thank you so much for all your comments. I'm going to make sure I go back through them all again afterwards as well and follow up some.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jessie and Laura. That's been really fascinating, and lots of interesting discussion in the chat, as you noticed. I'm going to open the chat up now for people to post any specific questions to direct to Jessie and Laura, and I'm going to field them and share them. Really, the comments in the chat have been more comments rather than questions so far, and sharing, which is lovely, but I haven't noticed any direct.
I did notice one question. So there was a question about work that kind of links up what's happening in libraries and in the community with what's happening in schools.
Lovely.
And I thought I'd just mention the National Literacy Trust project, World of Stories, that's engaging very much with that. And Sarah McGowan, who was mentioned by Laura today, and Laura and I all supported that project. So there is some really interesting work happening. So I'm sure you can find that on the NLT website.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jessie. So we're getting a few questions coming in. So Debbie asks, what are your thoughts about the active view of reading from Duke and Cartwright? Is that something that you have any ideas about?
I would say in general that reading, as I said, really is an active process. I think the way that we weight the different aspects of reading might be different depending on which lens we're looking through and what we're focusing on and what the goal of what we're doing is. But I would certainly say that reading is an active process. That theoretical perspective is not one that I'm very familiar with. So I suspect it goes well beyond saying that. So I don't know, Laura, if you have anything to say on that.
Sorry, yeah, I'm just looking at it now. Yeah, I wouldn't want to say anything.
That's fine.
I think it does align very much with what we've said.
But perhaps something to come back to, Laura. Yeah, rather than putting you on the spot. What about a more general question? Would you suggest that reading all year group transitions is something we need to worry about less? That's kind of implicit in what you were saying, but perhaps that's not exactly what you want us to take away. I wonder if you'd like to say something a bit more about that.
I can start, Laura, if you'd like. So I think that the evidence suggests that there isn't a stagnation or a slump in the transition from primary to secondary school in relation to the knowledge and skills around reading and vocabulary that we were measuring. I've said that in quite a specific way because I think that's really important, and I think it allays some concerns that were out there. So I think we don't need to worry about that. That doesn't mean that we don't need to worry about supporting reading across transition. So, for example, what we do know is as young people move from primary to secondary school, the amount that they're reading tends to go down quite a lot. What we also know is that they may have had access to a particular librarian that they knew in primary school. If they were lucky enough to have a librarian, they may have had access to a library. They may have had a particular way of setting up the library that they were used to. What we do know is when they go into secondary, everything feels quite different. And so the things that were supporting their reading in primary school may not be there in secondary school. Now, that goes for the library and the resources and mentors around reading. It also goes for knowledge and skills. So one of the things that I think we do need to be a little bit conscious of is that the challenge thrown at young people when they move into secondary shifts dramatically. And so we need to be really conscious of that. So it's not that we don't need to support reading across the transition. It's just that we don't need to worry about it just going down on its own. We just need to make sure that we continue to support our young people so that whatever reading knowledge and skills they have, I mentioned how variable it is, that we try and as much as possible bring those young people to the content that we want them to be able to read, and encourage them to continue engaging with reading if that's something that they want to do.
Just to add to that, I think one really big change in secondary school is that reading then becomes subject specific. So you're very much reading to learn, and whereas there's more of an emphasis in primary school of the intrinsic sort of motivations for reading and reading just for its own sake. And I think if there's anything that can happen in secondary schools to try and allow children to read just for enjoyment, and maybe sometimes that means broadening what is acceptable for secondary school students to be reading. So maybe we shouldn't be worrying quite so much about whether it's age appropriate and whether they're still reading Diary of a Wimpy Kid or whatever. I think needs to be a lot more fun involved in reading. And I know there are loads of secondary schools that are doing this brilliantly, especially when there's a school librarian who's in charge of and really in touch with the students and what they want to be reading and making sure that's available for them.
Thank you. I'm now getting inundated with questions, so forgive me if I miss you, anybody in the chat. But there's a couple here. So there's somebody asking about your advice for anybody working in teacher education. What would your advice be for raising the profile of reading for trainee teachers? And I'm going to give you a double whammy, a second one, which is about assessment in secondary schools for reading. What would you advise? Currently, there's a sort of standard reading age test at the start of the year. Do you have other suggestions? So there's two for you to think about at once there, Laura and Jessie.
So in terms of increasing the profile of reading, I think it's really my experience of working with so many primary and particularly secondary schools around reading, because I'm doing most of my work in secondary at the moment, is that it's really, really important to get that senior leadership buy-in. One really important approach for doing that is helping to draw the lines between the extent to which our young people can read and do read, and whether they access the curriculum and therefore learn what they need to learn to do well in their key stage 4 assessments at the end of secondary school. So sometimes just kind of drawing the lines between those two things is really useful for those senior leadership teams in secondary school. So I think the most important thing is to get that senior leadership buy-in. On assessment, that's something I'm doing a lot of work on at the moment. So my view is that we need to have a look at the information that we already have about young people. So what we know in secondary is we know the SATs results that our young people come up with. There is a real challenge around interpreting those SATs results, though, because you can do well in SATs for a number of different reasons, and you can also do less well in SATs for a number of different reasons. So they're not a pure measure of whether someone can read, is a successful reader, or whether they do read. So it is called the reading SATs, but it's more a curriculum level assessment of whether they've met the targets related to the English curriculum at the end of primary school. What we want to know is kind of underneath that, do they have the reading proficiency that they need? And if we want to know that, we need to use a different kind of assessment. And so what I would advocate is using a screening assessment to make sure that you don't miss anybody. So to make sure that nobody falls through the net. But as Laura said earlier, you really need to follow that up with a diagnostic assessment to confirm reading needs and to specify what aspect of reading the need relates to, so that you can carefully align reading needs with targeted support or even universal support in the classroom. So you need that combination. So you need the screening tool because you need to do something feasible with everyone so you don't miss anyone. But then you need something more precise and one-to-one so that you can make sure that everybody that gets a low score on the screening tool actually does have a reading need, because it might be that they just weren't paying attention or something like that, or didn't want to engage. So you need to check it, and you also need to specify what the reading need is. So that would be my view on assessment. Laura, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, great, definitely.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that it's important, and I know Teresa will welcome this. It's really important not just to be thinking about can they read and what's the reading proficiency. It's also thinking about what's available to them. What are the resources looking like? How can we support and give them the opportunities to read as well? And how can we also look at what they're needing to read in the school curriculum and making that alignment as well? So it's not just focusing in on that, it's also taking this global picture. And what else do we know about this young person? Here are the scores that we have. What else do we know about what's going on with this young person? I won't get distracted by talking to you about reading ages because that word came up. If you are interested in my views on that, you can have a look at the various things I've written for TES on that. But the bottom line is reading ages are really misleading, and there are other alternatives that are much, much better.
Thank you. I wonder if we've got time. I don't know if Laura was going to come in on anything there. Are you okay, Laura?
No, I think the only thing to add is that there are really, really good systems for working out how to support, like Jessie explained, how to support reading proficiency. And I think what we really need to work much harder on is figuring out how to support reading engagement and figure out, like Jessie was saying, about the individual child and what they want to be reading. Yeah.
And on that point, just for Laura again, there's a really interesting question in the chat from Chris Baker about what's the evidence about that symbiotic relationship between proficiency and engagement.
Yeah, so we know that more proficient readers read more books, but we also know that the more proficient you are at reading, the more you can get from a text. So it goes both ways. So it's not just in terms of exposure. The proficiency is important, not just in terms of sort of motivating you to read more. It's important in terms of helping you to get more from the text. So it frees up resources so that you're actually able to focus on gaining the meaning from the text. Does that answer the question?
Yes, that does. I think I'm going to have to stop you there so we finish on time, but that has been really fascinating. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for your questions in the chat. I'm sorry if we haven't managed to get to all of you, but you will be able to follow up the presentation and slides and the links that have been shared today. So that's fantastic. I think Teresa's just got a couple of things to tell you about before we close today. Teresa, over to you.
Sorry, I needed to unmute. Thank you very much, Laura and Jessie. Been fascinating. Had lots of notes and lots of conversations to come to explore this interplay between the will and the skill, the engagement and the proficiency. We just wanted to share what only next we've got coming up as an online seminar, but also the fact that we do, as an Open University team, run a Key Stage 3 and a primary culture of reading programme, which is a whole school programme to support schools in developing the deeper engagement with young people and their desire to read on. So if you're interested in that, Helen's going to pop the link in the chat line, but do follow up and explore with us. We're always full every year. We're at beyond capacity. So if you think that's of interest to your school or your setting, many librarians working with us too. And actually, this next week or the week of World Book Day, we've got Joe Chaler as part of that programme for our primaries, and indeed Phil Earle, which is going to be hugely exciting this Thursday with our secondaries. And so all the secondary pupils will, or those that the school have chosen, will get to hear Phil Earle or indeed Joe Chaler. And then we've got sessions for the staff as well. As obviously there are conferences and whole other pieces. But just because we were so pleased to get Joe and Phil, I thought I'd just share that. We've got a conference in Doncaster coming up, lining up actually very much with what Jessie and Laura were sharing about getting to know your readers, respecting their rights, as you were, honouring those rights and giving them a voice. Sophia Ahmed is joining us. So if you're anywhere near Doncaster, it's only 45 quid for a Saturday with lots of workshops, keynotes by Sophia and myself, and lots of workshops run by teacher reading group leaders and others. Do join us. And then the next seminar, unusually for the OU, since this has only happened in the very early days of setting up the Literacy and Social Justice Centre, is to actually have members of staff sharing. So this next time round, there are going to be 4 of us exploring informal book talk in the early years and Key Stage 1. Huge consequence and potential for the value of actually Key Stage 2 too. So it's not really an early years seminar. It'll be open for all. What can we learn when we listen to the casual conversations that young people have one with another about text and indeed with their teachers? What can we learn about how that might support their development of identities as readers and their journeys as seeing themselves as readers and developing that sense of deeper engagement through the text, but also their identity creation? So that's our next one. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. We're delighted to have had these 2 eminent scholars coming with us.